Okay, let's talk fraud. Let's get straight to it. The last session ran over. I guess this was the topic for this one, so I'm glad they got a head start on us. So I have David Sendroff here, CEO of Forensiq. He'll introduce himself with a nice little story. So I'm Kanwar Dhaliwal. I'm CEO of Everflow, for those of you who don't know me. And David has a long, distinguished career in fraud or anti-fraud. And so to get started, we were like, let's come up with a tidbit. David's going to surprise us. Something about you that nobody knows, but it's interesting.
So he had me start to prepare for this question last night at the happy hour.
So I told him this last night after like 10 drinks.
So I try to think of what was something that I really have not told anyone. And actually, I thought back in 1999, I was in college, and I was in an IRC chat room. And if any of you remember IRC.
Who knows IRC? Raise your hands.
Yeah, so there's some of you, right? And one of the guys I was associated with, he tells me about this toolbar you can install in your browser that would pay you for surfing the web. And I thought, oh, that's pretty interesting. He said, and it was the MLM of browsing, of surfing. So essentially, you could add other people underneath you. You're getting paid for all the browsing that they're doing. I said, well, I'll sign up, but you've got to put people underneath me. So he comes back, I don't know, maybe a month later, and he says, did you do your surfing for the month? And I said, no, I didn't. So I went and did my 24 hours of surfing, and I got a $5,000 check in the mail. I was like, wow, this is crazy. Like, what happened? I started chatting with the guy. Like, how did that happen? He said, well, I wrote a script, and I signed up hundreds of accounts under me, and he was, I guess like this was the start of fraud back 20 years ago, and I was like an intermediary in this thing, kind of like the industry today, right?
Was that a real check or the Ed McMahon sweepstakes check?
This was legit, and in $5,000 in college, that's
it's a lot of money.
That's a good amount of money.
Yeah.
So
excellent.
Quick question: was it called All Advantage?
It was.
That was my first check online.
Oh yeah, nice. Were you in that IRC chat room too? Maybe you were you might have been the guy. Did you put those people underneath me?
Any other check recipients from that here?
I quit my job at McDonald's.
Nice.
But it's a true story.
Yeah, hilarious.
So in solidarity, I decided to share something about myself too. But mine isn't that long or interesting of a story. So in my school years, my 12 years of school, I spent them in 8 different schools. Not that you could say I was moving around or I was getting expelled. We'll leave that for tonight. Okay, we'll get right to it. So there was a question before about fraud, definition of fraud, and so forth. So we'll take those as well. We'll talk more about that. David obviously has a lot of context in this space. But we'll start with what is a general state of fraud in the industry today, across the board, mobile, desktop, all digital?
Sure. So I was a part of a marketing company before starting Forensiq, and we had a network, and we were experiencing a lot of fraud. So I created pretty simplistic solution. It was some JavaScript that would load on each conversion and start to look at pretty simple elements there. And we're catching about $100,000 a month in fraud. And I thought, this should be a business. So we spun it out. That was the start of Forensiq. And what fraudsters are great at is really exploiting systems. If there's some way to capture revenue, they're looking at how do they exploit the system, and it's a constant evolution. It's a constant evolution. I think when it comes to cheers.
The beer man cometh. Thank you, sir.
When it comes to marketers, they're pretty sophisticated, especially fraudulent marketers. they understand marketing. They understand that conversion, there's some type of fall off, right? That there's engagement, but not everyone's going to be engaged. There's different parts of the flow that folks need to get to. And so they continue to evolve, and they're downloading apps, they're generating leads. There's been a lot of industry trade groups like the IAB and TAG that have created some initiatives around ads.text, for instance. There's been a lot of domain spoofing where ads.text allows you to, as a publisher, put what partners are able to sell your inventory, and it creates a lot of transparency. But then these things, they lead to social engineering, because then folks figure out, once they're approved through certain sources, they know they can, that's a way to exploit the system and sell through that publisher on that network or whatnot. So I think there's continually, folks are evolving, but really everyone's paying the price.
And do you think fraud is more rampant in mobile, and why, if it is?
I think it's easy to shine a spotlight in mobile, because mobile is a growing channel. It's somewhere around 7 billion right now, and
is that just CPI, or is that?
I think that's in the CPI space, and we're seeing that somewhere around 25% of that is fraudulent, suspect type of traffic. If you look at Cheetah Mobile as an example, they were just called out in a BuzzFeed article, and this is, public company, right?
And a big public company.
Yeah. So what they did was they had these apps, utility apps, keyboard apps that were overly permissioned, where they could load on a reboot, auto start these apps, and they could layer on top of the app where they could sense what you're typing into the keyboard. So let's say you went to the Play Store and you're searching for a specific app. Before you install the app, they could call the server-to-server call and take credit for that install and actually open the app to ensure that they're getting paid. So these folks are very, very sophisticated, and these are real companies. Megacast was another one, where they're out there, they're buying apps that have a lot of users. They swap out the monetization mechanism, and they're performing a lot of mobile device hijacking, click spamming, a lot of different activities, and they had 20 million unique devices that they could run this type of fraud through. In mobile, I think it's more difficult to measure fraud, because it's not as easy to run JavaScript. You've got
you only have so many IPs.
Yeah, shared IPs, right?
Yep.
And so it can become a challenge there. There's different, it can be tough to fingerprint these devices.
And how much of the fraud do you think is attribution fraud, like versus people manufacturing installs, bots and all that sort of stuff, versus just stealing organic installs?
Well, I think that attribution fraud is the simplest in terms of, you could just throw a bunch of clicks in the background, as simple as that to capture those conversions. Whereas data centers, if you're out and you're simulating devices and you're using data centers, then those things can be flagged easier, data center versus kind of true IPs. One interesting thing we're seeing with iOS is, in the beginning of last year, we saw about 25%. We were flagging about 25% of the fraud coming from iOS, and toward the later part of the year, it was more like 50%, or maybe a little more than that. And I'm not sure if that's an evolution of the fraudsters, or if we're just able to better detect that through better algorithms. But I thought that was pretty interesting. And then, it's not to say that web fraud is going away. It's still very prevalent with things like cookie stuffing, lead fraud and those sort of things. There's just that mobile is a really hot topic right now.
Right. And with the latest ITP changes, that's going to have a significant impact on this. We'll see how that plays out. Obviously, Apple's taking the lead there, but the bigger market share belongs to Google, so we'll see how that plays out. But I do think that industry will have to shift to the post-back-based tracking to address that. So talking about the industry, like there's a spectrum of players. You have advertisers, brands, agencies, networks, media buyers, publishers, and then you have technology platforms. Where does responsibility lie, in one area versus another? Obviously, different parties have different capabilities. So who do you think is capable and carries a burden of doing something about it?
I think everyone's responsible for fraud, and that goes from the networks to the advertisers, agencies, even the government is getting involved in fraud. And if you think back to the SMS subscription business, that was pretty prevalent in the U.S., and folks were just printing money on these subscriptions, and people hadn't really signed up. There was a lot of fines that were being paid, millions of dollars in fines, and the marketers were okay with the fines because they were just printing money from this type of thing. And then the regulators come in and they shut it down. All the carriers, shut this down. I know businesses had to close, but they had made a lot of money. Today, that exists in developing markets, this SMS fraud. And the marketers and the carriers, they want it to continue, and they're looking for solutions to solve for this before the regulators come in. So I think, if we look at our industry here, it's important that we all come together and to put the right controls in place so that the governments don't have to get involved. Just because you have police in your town, it doesn't mean you don't lock your doors. And just because you lock your doors doesn't mean you don't have an alarm system, right? And so fraud it's a $20 billion problem right now. And everyone's got to come together to take accountability and to work together, to put systems in place. It's interesting because there's conflicts of interest that exist in every industry. I mean, think about the medical community. There are surgeries that are happening that aren't required or aren't necessary. That you bring your car to a Jiffy Lube and you're getting upsold on things your car doesn't need. So these things exist in every industry, and then in our industry, it's not fraud is revenue for everyone except for the brands, but the incentives are not just at the company level, but they're also down to the individual level where folks are making a commission. They want to hit their sales metrics, right? And so, I think it's important to come together. We are seeing a shift right now in kind of a trend where advertisers and the sell side folks are actually coming together and using fraud detection and collaborating together with those fraud vendors to be able to navigate through the different instances and help to fight this together.
Got it. Now there's again a spectrum of things that can be done, from basic sensible things, measures, maybe tools and technologies, to more complicated. What are the common types of fraud, and what are the basic things that people can do? Maybe touch on the spectrum of things, like from easy to hard. But there's effectiveness doing everything, right? But obviously you can tackle the easy things first. So maybe you can touch on that, since you are a technology provider in the space.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So, I said this before. I think the most common fraud is really attribution fraud, because it just takes clicks to could be just getting lucky with sending the right clicks. But if you were to check for, and I think maybe this was mentioned, but just high click rates or low conversion rates or something as simple as that could be some sort of measure. You want to understand the reputation of publishers. For instance, you wouldn't buy on Amazon without reading the reviews and without for both on the product level and understand.
Seller.
Yeah, like the seller, right? And so I think that the same thing goes with a publisher. Oftentimes, when we identify fraud, if we were to go back and look at the reviews, and you're seeing that, this was draining the battery, or that there was, it slowed my device down. There's too, kind of automatically redirected me into the App Store, or you're going to see a lot of the things that we're catching with technology. You could have vetted and caught ahead of time and not have to have dealt with, shutting them off and all the other issues there. I think that looking at the IP who-is details, you can uncover things like the data centers, hosting providers. Is it all AWS or Google Cloud or Joe's data center? Those sort of things.
I mean, you touch on things that are pretty obvious, where 0.001% conversion rate is, that's pretty obvious, right? I mean, one way to do that is you could just demand a higher conversion rate, right? And a lot of that would definitely go away. But there are metrics that can be put in place in terms of distribution of IPs at a source level or a subsource level, distribution of device IDs, or how they're churning. Touch on that as to where that capability should reside and who should be doing that.
Mm-hmm. Well, with all these simple fraud techniques, you could do all these things, right? But unless you're really going to master fraud detection, right? This is sort of dabbling, right? And I think it's important to deploy third-party solutions that have dedicated teams and data science folks and have centralized databases, right? So, I mean, like all of these things I think are possible.
Yeah, so I mean, like I can touch on this from our perspective too, because at the platform level, we're in the click path. We see every click that goes through. We have a tail of traffic, going back, and with lots of volume. So these are kind of table stakes things that can and should be done at the platform level. Obviously, there's more. Obviously the name of the company is very apt, but like there's more forensic type stuff where you're actually, doing more invasive, maybe it's JavaScript or maybe it's further analysis of things that you necessarily don't do at the platform level. So, I think that, and we've taken this approach as well at Everflow, where there are things that are very sensible that we should be and will be and are doing, right? But then there's going to be things on the more complicated end of the spectrum, and maybe touch a little bit on that, where Forensiq stands out, or where you think its solution needs to stand out in general.
Sure. So, I think when it comes to more advanced techniques, there's a lot of full funnel fraud that's taking place right now, where folks are able to fake engagement. I think that is that is the future, right, of fraud, and I'll talk a little more about that. But with last click attribution, and you get the Cheetah mobiles, they're able to proxy through these residential IPs, and they're spamming clicks. They've got real device IDs. If it's the fraud where they can just kind of flood clicks, and it's really a game of chance. But there's then the more sophisticated type stuff. And when it comes to Cheetah Mobile or any of these sort of bad actors, there's a social engineering aspect where these are guys, they're at the conference, they're wearing a suit, they're masquerading as real people, and these are companies that exist out there. They have happy hours and whatnot. So like this is it would appear to be a real business. The fraudsters are able to fake viewability now. Viewability has become the currency in display advertising, and now folks are able to fake that. So
let's rip on Cheetah Mobile for a bit. So we know that company well. Mahi, who was here in the morning for the keynote, for those of you who were there for that. So when we were at Opera, and Mahi was the CEO at Opera MediaWorks, Cheetah Mobile is a multi-billion-dollar company. They were actually in talks to buy Opera. They were in talks to buy another multi-billion-dollar company that put together a group of companies and funds for that. So if all of that was funded by Clean Master app, who remembers Clean Master? I know, Kurt, you bought a condo. I know. So, but yeah, I mean, I think that's the level to which this succeeded and continues to succeed. You have multi-billion-dollar companies trading on stock markets that are actually making a business out of that. Mm-hmm. Right? How do you counter that? I mean, they have influence, right? Obviously, Google did what they could do, and they can do a lot to put them in their place. But I mean, they were quite dominant, and who's to stop another one of these to emerge? Or do you think that the industry has matured, at least on the mobile side, to not let that happen?
Well, I do think that fraud detection is catching these patterns, right? We were seeing Cheetah Mobile back in the beginning, and protecting our clients from this. So fraud does leave clues. There's a lot of this sophisticated tactics, but everything leaves clues, right? And I have some more of these advanced type of things, declaration fraud we're seeing, where there's 320 by 50 banners that are selling 1024 by 768 interstitial ads. So these are, and same thing with small banners where they're stuffing video ads in there. These are how they're able to capture higher CPMs. And then we're seeing a trend right now, this pretty crazy trend of IoT botnets. So if you might have heard of the Mirai botnet, where a couple of 16-year-old kids from New Jersey found that there's a lot of these IoT devices that are just using standard out-of-the-box passwords. And they wrote a script to take over these devices. They had 50 million IPs and devices that they were able to command and control as a botnet. And the FBI eventually caught them, flipped them. They now work for the FBI, but there's copycats. There's now copycats, and they're out there. They're using the same script as them. So it's in the past where it was you needed grandma to click on a link, to infect her computer with malware. These are a lot more difficult to deploy malware, and there's no FCC regulation on hardware and on the software on these IoT devices. So I think that is definitely a threat, and it's up to the fraud vendors to keep up with these trends.
So it has no UI either, right? So it's not it's a pretty expert job to be able to go into that. So that's a scary thing that you brought up, because when we went from hundreds of millions of desktop computers to billions of phones, we know what happened there. Obviously, there's a big market, but wherever there's honey, there's going to be flies. And now we're talking about tens of billions of IoT devices, if not more. Mm-hmm. Right? So this is going to get interesting. I hope you guys are working hard on that.
We are. I mean, these are things we're focused on.
Awesome. So the next question I was going to ask, I think we kind of just answered that. I mean, is fraud getting bigger as an issue or not? I think it's clearly, right? It's just a prevalence of like devices and the complexities, and obviously the federated version of these devices, there's not a single operating system. So you could write a virus that can infect a lot of devices, but that can also be cleaned by one solution, right? And now the whole problem is a lot more complicated. So talk about how you see fraud going forward in terms of growth of fraud. Obviously, that's going with the growth of the market, mm-hmm. but like it's getting to be a bigger problem.
Yeah, well, Juniper Research is an independent research firm. They're saying that fraud is a $42 billion problem in 2019. So it's pretty significant. I'm not sure.
Is that just in the U.S.?
Great question. That could be.
Well, I mean, the ad market in the U.S. digital ad market is about 160 to 180 billion. So that kind of makes sense. A quarter of that.
Yeah. So it's quite large. And like I said, there's some industry initiatives, IAB, the tags. They're making some headway. But these are not, they're not the end all for fraud detection. They're catching kind of the more simple stuff. And these are not kind of teens, with doing Instagram fraud. These are very sophisticated, organized crime operations that continue to evolve and invest into the channel. So we are seeing growth. I think that fraud is the most profitable type of passive revenue that exists today. I mean, it's literally allows them to print money. In the past, there was the cookie stuffing in lead fraud, and what's happening is there's an evolution into new channels. So, the CPIs, CTV, and OTT, as these things emerge, they create new exploitable opportunities. With CTV and for instance, there's a lot of things that are happening in server side where you're not deploying JavaScript, and you have to really trust the header data that's being passed along. So this creates an opportunity for fraud, to come into that space. So I don't think it's necessarily a 42 billion yet, but I think it's quite large, and it's not like you can just pass laws and the crime goes away. Right. This is something that everyone can come together to fight it. And I think, when it comes to stopping fraud, I think it's important to have standards within a company and to follow those certain protocols. Understand how your organization is dealing with fraud, down to the employee level. So you have systems, and what's an acceptable threshold for fraud? Is it 10%? When do we shut it off? When do we charge back? When do we have conversations? Because unless there's enough leverage, and folks will just continue. So we have to fight fraud with our wallets. And so I think fraud vendors can help with the process. One thing I wanted to call out for Everflow is I think it's great you guys have created an open system to allow folks to plug in different vendors, especially from a fraud standpoint, whereas some of the other platforms are forcing their own specific fraud vendors. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can't speak to many other cases, but they may have an overlapping or competing play in that, right? We have a different approach, as I was talking about it earlier, where we are in the click path, we can crunch those numbers and come up with a lot of sensible tools and suggested practices on top of that to address these things. So on that spectrum, I think we can definitely cover a lot on the low to mid tier of that, right? Mm-hmm. And if that addresses a lot of the problem, that's already built in. That's turnkey in the platform. But then there's obviously stuff that a focused team like you guys would that'd be your job. So talk about what's your prediction for the next 5 years in the industry?
Yeah, I think it will be interesting the way that fraud's going to evolve over the years. So we've seen, for instance, engagement within apps. Fraudsters are able to get to a certain level of a game to simulate what's real engagement. So we talked about the end of CPI, and that folks are moving to this deep engagement, but they're already able to kind of record different things and get deeper into funnels. But I think, and another example is we've seen bots within dating apps, right? And they're engaging individuals, right? And so there's going to be an evolution of kind of AI and more sophistication to get to kind of show these KPIs, where in the past, fraudsters in the web world, they were, they might have very calculated, mouse movements in different directions, and they started recording mouse movements. And we continue to see that evolution, but I think it's going to get smarter. Another example of that is looking at phone orientation. So there's accelerometers in the phone, and fraud, from a fraud vendor, you can see kind of how the phone's being held, or you can see is someone walking or running or sitting. I think in the future, all of these things, they will be so sophisticated to make it look like you are using the phone, walking, running, all the normal things that humans are doing. Yep. That this will continue to evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to add a little anecdote to that, we have a client that's actually moment marketing company. They basically just capture moments appropriate moments, like so phone orientation, if the person is in a car, moving, and so forth, time of the day, weather, right? All those things are contextual inputs that are available, right? And they basically have a niche play in that. So obviously that gets even more complicated when you come up with from a fraud perspective. Now, would you say the weather wasn't what they said it was, or it wasn't moving? So now the input points are so many more,
Right.
right? So you guys need to do some catch up there.
Yeah.
That was a joke.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Any questions? I think there probably will be some, since we were talking about this last time around.
I have a question. So, do you think it's necessary to build out your own SDK to get within like a client's app to provide like even more in-depth fraud analysis, or do you think the tools that you guys are having, such as like knowing whether or not a phone is like being charged while an app is installed, or is someone actually moving the phone? Do you think it's necessary for the next step of evolution in fraud detection to have that SDK developed to see a little bit more, or like it's such as like jailbroken devices or anything like that? Is there any way you think that you'll evolve in that sense?
So right now we've been SDK-less and have been able to identify a lot of the fraud without that. But I would imagine over the years as fraud is evolving, that could be helpful, because, like I said, with the conflicts of interest, if you're trusting data that's being sent to you and everyone else's, fraud is revenue, there are risks there without having that in place yourself.
And SDK distribution is another challenge out there, right? I mean, there's fatigue out there. So, yeah, I mean, I think when we were talking about the spectrum of solutions, there's a lot that can and should, and I believe will be done before we get to the point of like, okay, the next incremental improvement is going to come from something invasive like that. That's it?
Just out of interest, David, do you get much insight into the perpetrators of fraud? So presumably it could be anything from companies involved in it to organised crime and stuff like that. Obviously those guys cloud what they do, but do you get much insight into who's actually committing these kind of frauds?
Well, it's interesting because there's different players involved in the funnel. So there's folks that are writing malware, for instance, right? Other folks that are deploying the malware, other folks that are buying cheap traffic and kind of have this plausible deniability. And the question really is, are all of those three players, are they all committing fraud, right? So I think folks, there could be Eastern Europeans, right, who are building it could be everywhere. But I do know that, for instance, like there are Eastern Europeans building the malware, right?
We can get more specific. Start calling out countries and cities and so forth.
Right.
Yeah.
So when it comes to the publishers, in the article, Cheetah Mobile claims that it wasn't them. It was the monetization mechanism or whatever, and that's been also kind of debunked by certain folks. So, but when it comes, within publishers, that there could be publishers who are benefiting from fraud, but haven't developed that SDK mechanism that is actually performing the click, the mobile device hijacking, click flooding, and all that other stuff that's going on, right? So the question is, do you consider them fraudulent, right? Have they done enough due diligence? Are they turning a blind eye? These are not as black and white. So it's not a simple question, but.
Kurt.
Yeah, so in a talk earlier today, we were discussing new channels to start testing and driving traffic, such as using influencers. So I was curious if you're tracking any fraud, if you're dealing with that at all. Are you tracking that and through influencers, and what type of fraud are you seeing with influencer traffic?
So we haven't personally built out a solution for influencers, but just like in display, the currency of display is viewability or attention, and in the influencer space, it's the followers are the currency, right? There's engagement and then there's followers, and there are a lot of folks who have purchased followers, and there's a lot of fake engagement. One thing that's interesting and this happens both in the display world but also in the influencer world, is there's algorithms that are looking at engagement as a measurement of whether something is fraudulent or not, right? And so in the web world, if you have a bot and the bot's only visiting these handful of websites, that would look suspicious. And so they would visit many additional sites that there's no incentive for them to visit, so they can build a bigger cookie pool and look like legitimate, humans. And the same thing in the influencer world, where they might click or engage or comment or do other things if they're human, let's say, or maybe they're bots, but they're wanting to show more engagement than the followers that they're being paid by, right? But there are some solutions that are flagging the quality of influencers and flagging what they believe to be the percent of real followers or non-real followers. I mean, these are solutions that exist. Yeah. For fake purchases in-app. What are the most common for fake purchases? Well, it's interesting.
Sorry, well, common method or? Oh, because the currency, the payment method.
Mm-hmm. So, you can acquire stolen credit cards for $1 each. They're pretty inexpensive, and if purchases are a KPI that folks are measuring, it wouldn't be difficult to do that. I think fraudsters generally look for the lowest barrier, and initially when we built the solution, we looked at lead fraud because it's so simple to take lead information and submit it and get paid, right? When it comes to a credit card submit, then a merchant processor over time is going to flag a bunch of fraudulent credit card transactions. So it doesn't take long for that type of activity to be caught. And that's where attribution fraud became a lot more popular, because if it's just as simple as stealing credit for an organic install or organic conversion or whatever the event is, the engagement is real. That person installs or whatever they do, it's going to be real engagement after the fact. So anyway, so it exists. You can buy credit cards, and perhaps that's a method that's being used. And I think that fraudsters are also padding margins by mixing fraud with legitimate traffic. And a lot of times if an advertiser is getting enough value out of traffic, they may continue with that sort of thing. But I know it's kind of a long, convoluted answer there. Did I answer your question? Okay. What else, guys?
Kurt.
Just
Okay, well, round of applause for David. Thank you. Thank you, man.